The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the quiet suburban neighborhood. Rows of perfectly trimmed lawns and orderly homes lined the streets, each house a symbol of peace and conformity. The air was thick with the scent of freshly mowed grass, and birds chirped lazily from the trees. On the surface, it was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed out of place. But for Grandpa, it was home, his sanctuary after a lifetime of service and sacrifice. At 72, he was content with his small, modest house, the only remnant of his younger days as a decorated military officer. Yet, even in this seemingly perfect neighborhood, something dark was beginning to stir. Grandpa sat in his rocking chair, the one he'd inherited from his own father, as he watched the world go by. His frail hands gripped the arms of the chair, fingers trembling slightly as they always did in his older age. He didn't mind the slower pace of life, the quiet rhythm of the days blending into each other. But today was different. Today, the gentle hum of suburban life was disrupted by the arrival of the HOA officers. It wasn't the first time they'd been to his home. Over the past few months, he had been receiving increasingly bizarre notices from the Homeowners Association, violations for things as trivial as the angle of his front doormat or the alignment of his mailbox. But today, something felt different. The officers approached with a sense of urgency, their faces tight with authority. As they marched up the driveway, Grandpa's heart skipped a beat. He could tell they weren't here for the usual petty complaints. He set his coffee mug down on the porch and stood up slowly, his old bones creaking as he did. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harris." One of the officers greeted him coldly, his voice sharp and businesslike. "We need to discuss the state of your lawn. It's not up to code." Grandpa's gaze flickered to the neatly manicured grass beneath his feet. He'd always taken pride in it. "What do you mean, not up to code? It's just grass." The officer stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "It's uneven, and you've allowed some weeds to grow on the edges. You'll need to fix it immediately or face a fine." Grandpa blinked, trying to process what he was hearing. The absurdity of it hit him, but there was no mistaking the look in the officer's eyes. He wasn't joking. This was real. "Look," Grandpa said, raising his hand slightly, trying to steady his voice. "I'm not in the best shape these days, but I'll get to it when I can." The officer's eyes hardened. "We don't have time for excuses, Mr. Harris. You have 48 hours to fix this, or we'll take further action." Before Grandpa could protest, the officer pushed past him, roughly shoving his shoulder as he went. Grandpa stumbled slightly, caught off guard by the unexpected force. His heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out on his brow. This wasn't just an HOA officer doing his job. There was something darker at play, and Grandpa could feel it in the pit of his stomach. As the officer turned to leave, Grandpa steadied himself against the railing, his heart thudding loudly in his chest. He wasn't sure if it was the shock or the fear creeping into his bones, but he could feel his strength slipping away. "Mr. Harris." The officer's voice cut through his thoughts. "Next time, don't make things harder on yourself." Grandpa watched as the officer climbed into his patrol car, the engine roaring to life. But the officer's smug expression stayed with him long after the car disappeared down the street. Something was wrong. And Grandpa had a sinking feeling that the peace he'd known for so many years was about to be shattered forever. He shakily stepped back into the house, but as he did, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The house felt too quiet as Grandpa sat in his favorite armchair, nursing his aching arm. His bones ached more now than they ever had, and the dull throb from his fall refused to subside. His mind, however, raced. What had just happened? The officer's harsh words, and even harsher actions, still echoed in his head. He had always prided himself on standing tall, but today something had snapped inside him. He wasn't just dealing with an unreasonable fine anymore. Something more sinister was at play. But who could he turn to? The phone rang. Grandpa flinched, the shrill noise cutting through the tension that had settled in the air. He picked it up slowly, his fingers shaking. "Grandpa, is everything okay?" It was his daughter, Jenna. Her voice was sharp, but filled with concern. "I'm fine," Grandpa lied, his voice gruff and strained. "Just a little bruised, that's all." But Jenna could tell. There was a quiver in his words, a tremor in his tone that didn't match his usual strength. She didn't press him on the phone, but she knew something was wrong. She made up her mind in that instant. She was going to bring the family together. Within hours, the family began to assemble at Grandpa's house, each member showing up in their own unique way. But it was the bikers, the cousins who had always lived on the edge, that everyone was waiting for. Jenna paced the living room, a mixture of fury and worry burning inside her. She tried not to think about how helpless she felt, how her father, a proud veteran, had been humiliated in his own front yard. She could see it in his eyes. He was shaken, scared, and it broke her heart. Her cousin, Rick, was the first to arrive. His Harley's roar rattled the windows before the rumbling stopped in the driveway. The door swung open with a loud bang, and in walked Rick, a hulking man in his mid-30s, tattoos crawling up both arms, his face hardened from years of living on the edge. The moment he saw Grandpa, his expression softened just enough to reveal his deep-rooted concern. "What happened?" Rick growled, his voice low and menacing. He didn't need details. He knew something was wrong. Grandpa shook his head, the words trapped in his throat. "They broke my arm," he said, his voice quiet but heavy with disbelief. Rick clenched his jaw. His fingers twitched, itching for action. But he didn't speak. Not yet. He turned, grabbing his phone from his back pocket and dialing. "Get the others," he said, his tone cold. "It's time to handle this." The air in the room thickened as the rest of the cousins began arriving. One by one, each larger than life, each hardened by the streets. Jake, the youngest, his face still covered in scars from previous battles, stormed in next, followed by Tony, whose piercing gaze could cut steel. Together, they had seen it all, from street brawls to illegal deals. But they had one rule: family first. And this was personal. "The ake HOA?" Tony asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "Those assholes think they can treat Grandpa like this." Rick slammed his fist onto the table, his anger simmering just below the surface. "We're not letting this slide," he spat, his tone harsh. "It's not just about the arm. It's about respect. And they've crossed the line." They gathered around Grandpa, their faces a mix of fury and determination. Grandpa had always been their protector, their mentor. And now it was their turn to defend him. Jake, the quiet one, looked to Rick. "What's the plan?" Rick's eyes burned with cold fire as he turned to the window, staring at the quiet streets outside. The neighborhood had always seemed so safe, so idyllic. But now it felt like a ticking time bomb. "The HOA's about to get a wake-up call," Rick said, his voice dark with promise. "We're going to show them what happens when you mess with family. We're going to make sure they regret this." As the cousins gathered their plans, the tension in the air thickened, each moment heavy with the weight of what was to come. They weren't just fighting for justice. They were fighting for a sense of honor that had been trampled underfoot. And as they suited up, strapping on leather jackets and preparing their bikes, one thing was clear: the calm, suburban world they had known was about to be torn apart. And the HOA officers would soon learn that they had no idea what kind of storm was coming their way. The cousins revved their engines, the deep growl of their motorcycles shaking the foundation of the house, signaling the beginning of something unstoppable. The clock was ticking. The battle was set to begin. The low growl of motorcycles echoed through the neighborhood, the sound creeping up from the distant horizon, growing louder with each passing second. In the peaceful suburban streets, where the occasional family sedan was the loudest sound to break the stillness, something far more menacing was approaching. The cousins, the biker crew, had assembled, and they were coming in full force. Rick stood at the front of the house, his arms crossed, eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon. He could feel it, the energy in the air, the way the tension seemed to stretch in every direction. He wasn't just waiting for his cousins to arrive. He was waiting for the moment when everything changed. The peace of this place, this sterile suburban illusion, was about to be shattered. He could almost taste it. One by one, the others rolled in, Jake, Tony, and the rest of the crew, each pulling up on their roaring machines with a force that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. The sound of the engines was deafening now, each bike echoing like the warning of a storm to come. Rick's crew was a tight-knit family, bound by loyalty, grit, and a sense of justice only they could understand. They didn't need words to communicate. Their presence spoke volumes. Tony, the heavy-set cousin with a grizzled face and a heart of steel, was the first to step off his bike, tossing his helmet onto the hood of the car parked nearby. His dark eyes met Rick's, and without a word, they both knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about some petty HOA rules anymore. This was about respect, about standing up for the people who had given everything to the community, only to be crushed by the cold, unfeeling hands of power. "I don't like how this is starting to feel," Jake muttered, the youngest of the crew, but by no means naive. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of unease buried deep in it. "Something's off about this whole situation." "Yeah," Rick said, his jaw tight. "I can feel it too. These guys are more than just a couple of pencil pushers. They've been hiding something, and I'm willing to bet it's a lot worse than just some broken arm." The cousins exchanged tense glances as the final members of their crew arrived. They weren't just a family. They were a force. Each one had a past that could fill volumes, lives spent on the wrong side of the law, filled with secrets and shadows. But when it came to family, they were untouchable. That bond, forged through years of struggles, made them an unbreakable unit. And right now, the HOA officers were about to find out exactly what happens when you mess with them. Rick turned to Grandpa, who was now standing by the porch, his face pale but resolute. The old man had seen battles in his time, fought wars both abroad and within his own country. But this was a different kind of war. "You okay?" Rick asked, his voice softer now, though the fire still burned in his eyes. Grandpa nodded slowly, his grip tight on the porch railing. "I've lived a lot of years, Rick, but I never thought I'd see the day when a bunch of men like that would make me feel weak." Rick's face softened for just a moment. "You're not weak, Grandpa. You're one of the strongest men I know, and you raised us right." He turned away, giving a final glance to the crew who was now fully geared up and ready to roll. The countdown had begun. Each cousin revved their engines, the sound vibrating through the neighborhood. They were about to make a statement, one that the HOA would never forget. But as they prepared to leave, there was a nagging thought tugging at Rick's mind. Something didn't sit right. The officers hadn't just broken Grandpa's arm. There was something deeper here. This wasn't just about power trips or violations. The more he thought about it, the more the pieces didn't line up, and the question gnawed at him. What were these officers really hiding? Rick shoved the thought aside for now. There'd be time to figure that out later. For now, he had one focus: making sure these officers understood the consequences of their actions. The roar of the engines grew louder, drowning out the rest of the world. With a final look at Grandpa, Rick kicked his foot into the stirrup, and the crew surged forward, their motorcycles cutting through the streets like a pack of wolves. The quiet suburbia was about to be turned into a battleground. And no one, least of all the HOA, knew what was coming next. The bikes tore down the streets, their engines roaring in perfect synchrony, shaking the very ground beneath them. The once peaceful neighborhood was now pulsing with a sense of impending chaos. The thrum of powerful engines reverberated through the houses, sending ripples of anxiety through the neighbors. Curtains twitched, eyes peered out from behind windows, and the air felt thick with uncertainty. It was as if the whole neighborhood collectively held its breath, waiting for the storm to hit. Rick led the pack, his grip steady on the handlebars as he guided the crew towards the HOA headquarters. The streets, once familiar and comforting, now felt like foreign terrain, unfamiliar and charged with a sense of dread. Each turn brought them closer to the epicenter of this suburban war, the place where their anger and frustration would finally collide with the cold, calculating force of the HOA. As they reached the HOA office, Rick's heart beat faster, not out of fear, but anticipation. The sight of the pristine building with its perfectly manicured lawns and white stone facade felt like a mockery, a fortress of bureaucracy, a symbol of power that had been misused, twisted into something oppressive. The bikes came to a screeching halt in front of the office, their tires screeching against the pavement, the noise sharp and final. The crew dismounted, their boots thudding against the concrete as they circled the building. Tension crackled in the air. Every muscle in their bodies coiled tight, ready to spring into action. The officers inside had no idea what was about to descend upon them. Rick's eyes scanned the office building, his sharp gaze searching for the right entry point. "Stay close. And remember," he said, his voice low but filled with purpose, "we're here to make a point. No one's leaving until they understand what happens when you mess with family." Jake, ever the skeptic, glanced around nervously. "You sure about this? The cops could be here in minutes if we start tearing this place apart." Rick turned to him, his eyes steely. "If they're coming, they're coming. But we're not here to break anything. We're here to make them sweat, to show them who they're messing with." A cold silence fell over the crew, the kind of silence that only came before a storm, and that storm was closing in fast. The front doors to the HOA office slid open, and out stepped the man they'd all been waiting for, the head officer, Kevin Foster. Tall, well-groomed, and wearing an air of smug confidence, he strode toward them with his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes scanning the group. His gaze flickered briefly to Grandpa, who stood at the front of the crew, his arms still wrapped in a sling, but his posture rigid with resolve. "So this is how it's going to be." Foster's voice was smooth, almost condescending as he addressed the group. "A few disgruntled individuals think they can just roll in here and threaten the peace of this neighborhood." Rick stepped forward, his presence overpowering as he locked eyes with the officer. "You think you're the one who controls the peace around here? You think you can just push people around and break them without any consequences?" Foster smirked, the arrogance radiating off of him. "I'm just doing my job. You know how it is. People like you don't understand the rules of society." "Society?" Tony scoffed, stepping up beside Rick, his large frame casting a shadow over the officer. "We understand rules just fine. What we don't understand is how a group of so-called public servants can act like gods and destroy a man's life over a broken mailbox. Tell me, Officer Foster, how many families have you crushed for the sake of your rules?" Foster's expression flickered for a moment, irritation creeping into his eyes. "You don't know anything about what I've had to do to keep this place in order. This is bigger than your petty grievances." Rick's patience snapped. Bigger than family, bigger than respect. He stepped closer to Foster, the air between them thick with hostility. "You've messed with the wrong people." The silence stretched long, hanging in the air like a dark cloud. And then, without warning, Foster's smug demeanor began to crack, his shoulders tensing as he realized the weight of the situation. These weren't just angry citizens. These were people with the means and the willingness to bring the house down around him. "Do you know who I am?" Foster asked, his voice now tinged with a hint of desperation. Rick didn't flinch. "I know exactly who you are. And I know exactly what you've been doing behind closed doors." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder. "We've been watching you, Officer Foster, and everything you've been hiding. It's about to come to light." Foster's face drained of color. The air was electric now, the calm before the storm utterly gone. And as he took a step back, the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He was cornered. There was no escape from the storm that was about to break loose. The first drop of rain had fallen, and there was no turning back. The tension crackled in the air as Rick held the thick folder aloft, the weight of its contents hanging like a shadow over Officer Foster. The sun had dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows that made the HOA office look like a fortress on the edge of collapse. For a moment, everything was still, the only sound the distant hum of traffic on the freeway, and the restless whirring of cicadas in the trees. Foster's face was pale, his once confident demeanor unraveling in real time. His hands trembled slightly as he took a step back, his eyes flicking from Rick to the folder, then to the crew of bikers who stood, unwavering, with determination written across their faces. It was clear to everyone now. This wasn't just about a broken arm. It never had been. "What is this?" Foster managed, his voice strained, as if he were trying to regain some control over the situation. But the shaky breath he took betrayed him. "What are you talking about?" Rick didn't flinch, his jaw set in a grim line as he slowly opened the folder. "Everything you've been hiding. The illegal fines, the extortion, the manipulation of property values. You thought you could push people around and get away with it, but you were wrong." The officers who had been lurking behind Foster exchanged uneasy glances, their faces slowly falling into an expression of dawning realization. They'd known something wasn't right, but they hadn't expected this. Foster had been their leader, their authority. But now, as Rick flipped through the pages of the dossier, it was clear that the officer they had trusted had been pulling strings for his own gain. The papers in Rick's hands were damning. Documents detailing how the HOA had systematically targeted elderly homeowners, exploiting their vulnerabilities to force them into paying exorbitant fines or face threats of foreclosure. Some of the documents even revealed illegal kickbacks, money funneled into Foster's pocket from contractors hired to fix the violations the HOA created. This wasn't just petty bureaucracy. This was a scam that had been going on for years. "Tell me, Officer Foster," Rick said, his voice low and dangerous, "how many lives did you ruin for profit?" Foster's face twisted in a mix of anger and fear. "You don't know what you're talking about," he spat, but the words lacked conviction. He was cornered, and he knew it. The smugness that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a deep, gnawing panic. "I think we know exactly what we're talking about," Jake chimed in, his voice steady but cutting through the tension like a knife. "And if you don't want this to get out, you'd better start thinking about how you're going to fix it, because we're not going anywhere until you do." The group of bikers stood together, unyielding, as if a force field of anger and righteousness surrounded them. Foster looked to his officers for support, but no one moved. It was as if they all realized that this wasn't a battle they could win. Not anymore. I didn't mean for it to get this far," Foster stammered, his voice faltering. He took a step back, his eyes darting to the darkened streets, as though looking for an escape. "I never meant for people to get hurt." Rick stepped forward, his towering presence enough to make Foster flinch. "People like my grandpa. You've hurt plenty of people, Foster, and now you're going to pay." Suddenly, the door to the HOA office swung open with a sharp creak, and another officer stepped out. Officer Daniels, a younger man who had kept his distance from the escalating situation. He looked between the bikers and Foster, his face pale with confusion. "What's going on here?" Daniels asked, his voice trembling. Rick turned to him, his gaze hard. "We're here to make sure this all comes to light. You've been a part of this scam too, haven't you?" Daniels opened his mouth to protest, but the words died on his tongue as the full weight of the situation crashed down on him. It wasn't just about enforcement anymore. This was about corruption, and Daniels could no longer deny that he had been complicit. Foster, now visibly sweating, ran a shaky hand through his hair. "You can't just." "I can, and I will," Rick interrupted, his voice firm, cold with finality. "This ends tonight." The bikers stood in a loose circle, their presence a constant reminder of the storm that was brewing around Foster. The files in Rick's hands were only the beginning. If Foster didn't give them what they wanted, if he didn't fix the mess he created, everything would come crashing down. The family wasn't leaving until their demands were met. As Rick's words hung in the air, the light from the street lamps flickered, casting long shadows over the group. The neighborhood, once so pristine, felt more like a battlefield than a place of calm. Every house around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when the storm would finally break. Officer Foster swallowed hard, his eyes flickering with panic. This wasn't just a confrontation. This was the reckoning he had been avoiding for years. And the bikers weren't going anywhere until they had the answers they sought. "You think you can just tear it all down with a few documents?" Foster sneered, trying one last desperate push. "You think this is over?" Rick's expression never wavered. "It is now." And with that, the storm had officially arrived. The night had fallen deeper, a heavy cloak of darkness now enveloping the neighborhood. The street lamps flickered in sync with the rising tension, their dim glow casting eerie shadows on the quiet houses. The neighborhood, which had once felt so safe, now felt as though it were teetering on the edge of something far more dangerous. The calm that had reigned for so many years had been shattered, replaced by an overwhelming sense of inevitability. Rick stood in the middle of the growing storm, the weight of the folder still heavy in his hand. His face was an unreadable mask, his focus unbreakable. Around him, his crew was locked in place, a wall of intimidating silence that spoke louder than any words could. Every biker was a ticking time bomb of barely contained anger, but they knew that the endgame was near. It wasn't just about exposing the corruption. It was about making sure Officer Foster and his crew would never get away with this again. Foster, now visibly sweating, was cornered against the side of the office building, his back pressed up against the brick wall. His eyes darted from Rick to his officers, then back again. The smugness had disappeared, replaced by a desperation so palpable that even the night air seemed to grow heavier with it. "You can't just do this," Foster said, his voice cracking. "This is a mistake. You think you know what you're dealing with." Rick stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. "No, Foster. You don't get to make the decisions anymore. We know about the rigged bids, the fines you created out of thin air, the illegal dealings, all of it." He tossed another set of papers onto the pavement, and they scattered like confetti. Some of the bikers stepped forward, picking up the documents and scanning them quickly. They all knew what was inside: names, dates, amounts, every dirty little secret laid bare. "You think you're untouchable because of your badge, don't you?" Tony snarled, stepping into Foster's line of sight. "Well, that's over now. You're not hiding behind that facade anymore. The people you've hurt, they're gonna know what you've done." Foster tried to push his shoulders back, his arrogance still fighting to stay intact. But his eyes flickered to the door of the office behind him, as if he were searching for a way out, a final escape. But there was none. The bikers had him completely boxed in. The HOA headquarters was no longer a symbol of power. It was a trap, and the rats were caught. As the reality of his situation began to sink in, Foster's composure crumbled even further. His gaze shifted nervously from Rick's hard eyes to the file on the ground. The truth was there, laid bare before him, and there was no denying it. No amount of spin or lies could rewrite what had already been exposed. He had been caught in his own web, and now it was unraveling before his very eyes. I didn't want it to go this far," Foster muttered, his voice low and filled with a mix of panic and regret. "I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt. I just wanted to protect the HOA, to protect myself." "Protect yourself?" Rick's voice was a growl, laced with disbelief. "You didn't care about anyone but yourself, did you, Foster? You thought you could control people's lives with a few pieces of paper. You thought you could ruin families and sleep at night." Foster's face turned red, his fists clenching at his sides. "You have no idea what it's like. You have no idea what I had to do to stay in control." The pressure was unbearable. Jake, who had been watching quietly until now, finally spoke up. His voice was quiet but cutting. "You think that makes you a victim. You think that gives you the right to crush people for your own gain. My grandpa doesn't have to live in fear of people like you anymore." Rick's gaze never wavered. "It's over, Foster. You're done. You can either face the consequences like a man, or keep running. But you're not leaving this parking lot with your job or your freedom." Foster's mouth opened, but no words came out. His head dropped, defeated, as he finally understood the weight of what he had done. The bikers weren't going to let him get away with it. They weren't going to let anyone like him get away with it again. The officers behind him, once staunch in their loyalty, exchanged uncertain glances. They had seen the truth laid out before them, and though they had once been complicit, there was no denying that they were standing at the crossroads of a life-altering choice. And for some of them, the road forward was clear. Rick took one last look at Foster, his eyes cold and unflinching. "Get your things. You're going to fix this. All of it. If you don't, we'll make sure the whole world knows who you really are." With that, the bikers began to turn away. They had made their point. The storm had broken, and the truth was out. It was time for the pieces to fall where they may. The wind began to pick up, rustling the trees, sending leaves tumbling across the pavement like confetti, scattered by the storm that had arrived. The air felt thick with expectation as Rick and his crew walked away from the cornered Officer Foster. The quiet hum of the neighborhood seemed distant now, a mere memory. The energy had shifted. The quiet was gone, replaced by an undercurrent of tension that surged through every corner of the HOA office and out into the dark streets. Foster had stood frozen, a man undone by the very secrets he had tried so desperately to bury. The bikers' footsteps echoed in the silence, their presence overwhelming, their power palpable. It wasn't just the bikes, the leather jackets, or the intimidating tattoos. It was the sense of justice that hung around them like an unspoken promise. They weren't here to destroy. They were here to expose the rot that had festered for far too long. As Rick turned his back to the man who had once held all the power, a deep sense of satisfaction stirred in his chest. But even as he walked away, the nagging thought from earlier, the one that had kept him up the night before, lingered at the edges of his mind. What else were they hiding? It wasn't just about the broken arm anymore. It was about something far bigger. The more Rick thought about it, the more he realized that Foster and his team weren't acting alone. The corruption ran deeper. There were people above them, people whose strings had been pulled to keep this charade going. It wasn't just one bad apple. The entire tree was rotten. But there was no time to waste. The bikers had made their statement. The stakes had been set. Now, it was time to ensure that the truth got out, before Foster or anyone else could sweep it back under the rug. Rick stopped abruptly, a sense of purpose washing over him. He turned to his cousins, who had already begun loading their bikes back up, their earlier energy still crackling in the air. "Listen up," Rick called, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "This isn't over yet. We need to make sure everyone knows exactly what Foster's been hiding. It's time to take this beyond the neighborhood." Jake, who had been pacing nervously, stopped and looked at Rick. "You're saying what I think you're saying." Rick's gaze hardened. "We're going public. Tonight." Tony raised an eyebrow, his voice low. "You sure? It's risky. We're talking about people with power. Real power." "I know," Rick replied. "But that's exactly why we have to do it. If we let them cover it up, if we let them walk away from this, we're just as bad as they are." The crew exchanged uneasy looks, but Rick's words hit home. They had come this far. They had taken down the man who thought he was untouchable. Now they needed to make sure the world knew the truth. They weren't just fighting for Grandpa anymore. They were fighting for everyone who had ever been crushed under the heel of bureaucracy, for everyone who had ever been manipulated by the system. "We have to hit them where it hurts," Rick said. "We'll take this to the press, to social media, wherever it needs to go. We're not leaving until the whole city knows what Foster's been doing." Jake nodded slowly, his mind already working. "We'll need to dig deeper. If there's more, if there's something bigger, we'll find it." Rick's eyes narrowed. I already know there is. But this doesn't stop tonight. We're not just exposing Foster. We're exposing everyone who's been helping him pull these strings. The crew's resolve hardened, and Rick could feel the weight of their commitment in the air. This wasn't just a fight for Grandpa. This was a war against corruption, against a system that had forgotten what it meant to serve the people. As the bikers revved their engines and began to pull out, the streets seemed eerily empty, as if the whole world was holding its breath. The night was thick with suspense, but Rick wasn't afraid. He had come this far, and the truth was on their side. But even as they rode off, a flicker of doubt remained in Rick's mind. The HOA was just the tip of the iceberg. He had no idea how deep the corruption ran, but he knew one thing for certain. The fallout from tonight was just beginning, and they were only getting started. The road ahead stretched into the unknown, but Rick was ready. He had one goal: to make sure Foster and everyone like him paid for the lives they'd destroyed. And nothing, not even the threat of the system turning against them, would stop him. The storm had just begun. The roar of the engines echoed like thunder in the distance, growing louder as the bikers revved down the streets, leaving the quiet neighborhood in their wake. But for Rick, the sound wasn't just a victory cry. It was the soundtrack to the storm that was brewing. As the crew sped away from the HOA office, their minds were racing, strategizing their next move. They had exposed the corruption, but they knew the war wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. The flickering lights of the city loomed ahead, a stark contrast to the calm suburban streets they'd just left behind. Rick's mind was sharp, every turn and twist in the road offering a new layer of strategy, a new threat to anticipate. As the headlights of the bikes cut through the night, Rick's thoughts kept returning to the same question. What had they truly uncovered? The folder he presented to Foster had been damning, but Rick had a sinking feeling that it was only a small piece of a much larger puzzle. The deeper they dug, the more they uncovered. There were names that didn't belong, shadowy figures lurking in the margins of the documents, and financial transactions that didn't add up. Foster was just the front. There was a bigger, more dangerous entity pulling the strings. We need to get the press involved. Make sure it hits every outlet, Jake said, his voice filled with urgency over the sound of his bike's engine. Rick nodded, but his gaze remained fixed on the road ahead, his thoughts racing faster than his bike. It's not just the press. We need everyone to see what's been happening. Make the story impossible to ignore. Tony, who had been riding alongside Rick, grunted in agreement. The city's not ready for this. We're talking about powerful people. They're gonna fight back. I know, Rick replied grimly, his grip tightening on the handlebars. But they won't win. Not this time. The more Rick thought about it, the more the gravity of the situation sank in. They had sparked a fire, and the flames were already spreading. The media would take the story and run with it, but the real battle would be in the courts and the boardrooms, the dark places where deals were made and the truth was buried. Rick's crew had made a powerful statement, but now they needed to follow through. If they didn't, the truth could be twisted or erased before anyone even knew it existed. As they pulled into the city, Rick spotted a familiar figure standing in the shadows near an alleyway. It was Mitch, the tech guy from the biker crew who had been working on getting the information out to the right people. He waved them over, his face illuminated briefly by the streetlights. "Got everything you need," Mitch said, his voice low and urgent as he handed Rick a flash drive. "This has everything we uncovered. Video footage, documents, bank records. It's all there. I sent it to the news outlets too, but I'm not trusting them to get it all out there. You need to get this to the right people." Rick took the drive with a nod, the weight of the moment hitting him square in the chest. This was it. This was the tipping point. "Thanks, Mitch," Rick said, his voice steady. "You've done more than enough." Mitch's eyes flickered with a brief, grim smile. "Just make sure they don't get away with it. All of them." Rick watched as Mitch disappeared back into the shadows, his heart pounding in his chest. The pieces were falling into place, but the hardest part was yet to come. The moment they handed over that drive, the truth would be out, and the storm they'd started would hit with the full force of a tidal wave. As the bikers gathered around Rick, he could feel the finality of it all. They had crossed the line, taken the first step toward righting a wrong that had been allowed to fester for too long. Now they would need to ride this out, no matter the cost. Rick looked at his crew, their faces lit by the harsh streetlights, each one ready for whatever was coming next. "We've got one shot at this," he said, his voice strong and unwavering. "Once the media gets their hands on this, there's no going back. But we can't stop now. We've come too far." Jake looked over at Rick, his expression serious. "What if they come after us? What if this backfires? We're not running. We stand tall. We make sure everyone knows exactly who these people are, and we fight for what's right." They can't silence the truth. The roar of the engines filled the air again as the bikers prepared to ride out. The storm had reached its peak, and now the winds of change were sweeping through the city. The consequences were inevitable. Some might try to fight back, to push back against the wave of truth that was about to crash down. But Rick knew one thing for sure: the damage was already done. As they sped off into the night, the sound of their engines was more than just a noise. It was a declaration that the world would never be the same. And as Rick looked ahead, the weight of everything they had fought for hung heavy in the air. The storm was only beginning, but they were ready. The fight for justice had just begun, and this time, nothing would stop them. The final stand had arrived.